of their connections between Asian American and Palestinian communities. And we have with us today Reverend Naomi Southern, who's the pastor of the Berkeley Methodist United Church, a sister congregation of ours in Berkeley. Kira Zam is on staff here at Buena Vista. She is our community developer staff, but she's also very active on the Conference the Conference Philippine Solidarity Task Force, and brings that perspective both as a Filipina and a Palestinian. Peggy Saike is the Executive Director of Asians in Philanthropy and has done a lot of work with Muslim communities here in the Bay Area through that for philanthropic work. Lana Kiswani is the Executive Director of the Arab Resource Organizing Center, and Emily Lin, the Reverend Emily Lin, is the pastor of the Chinese Community Church in Chinatown. And so we're going to just ask them briefly to share thoughts on that question of their experiences of the connection between Asian American and Palestinian communities. Some of the panelists really want to, or just open up the conversation as a forum here as well. So they're going to try to keep it brief, and then we're going to have a few questions, but we want to try to open up the conversation. We really want to recognize, too, that when we talk about Asian Americans, it's a very diverse community, and the inclusiveness of that for the conversation is really important. So some of you embody that inclusiveness and not necessarily defined by the panelists as well. So with that, Reverend Naomi Southern.
Thank you. On behalf of the panel, we are so grateful for your patience and endurance. And we're going to try and make this entertaining, but we really felt that the last panel was so profound and moving that kind of feel it's difficult to follow that action. But I thought about a couple of stories I'd like to share about my own development. I grew up, the same time and place as my Joshi, and the awareness of one's ethnic heritage and status as a minority in this country really helped, I think, both of us and many people of our generation be aware of the need for justice for all, as the earlier panelists mentioned, and the need to make connections. So I have, in my work, been in contexts like that. For a while, years ago, I was the director of an organization called the National Federation of Asian American United Methodists. And I think I learned a lot in this context. Most of the folks that came to our national meetings were first-generation immigrants, and so their perspective was often a little different from mine. We had 7 groups: Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean, Indian, and Indo-Chinese, and Filipino as well. And this group got along famously through most of the national meetings. But every now and then, when elections came up, there was all kinds of struggle about who was going to get elected and who would have the most representatives on the executive committee, and people would shout, and actually sometimes someone threw a chair. And as the director of this organization, I always kind of dreaded our national meetings because you never knew what was going to happen. But I learned a lot from observing this. And as frustrating as it occasionally was, I realized that the people that were showing up to these meetings were really examples of courage and faith. They were showing up to a meeting where people of other national ancestry groups that had proclaimed war on them, had killed their relatives, had colonized them, had oppressed them, were going to be in the same room. And they came to work together with them and to try and make something happen. They came to a place where their wounds were almost certainly going to be opened. And after those chair-throwing incidents, everybody would calm down and get back together. So it really was so instructive to me about the power of people who are willing to walk into a room with people that you perhaps shouldn't trust, or you've been taught not to trust. Because I think suffering gives us a big choice. We can either become so absorbed in our suffering that we are unable to connect to anyone else's, and we can become fearful or aggressive or suspicious or vengeful. Those are all often perfectly justifiable reactions to suffering, I think. But we can also, if we are blessed in some way, be able to make the choice to see connections, to be willing to share our wounds, to be willing to be healed by people from the same national ancestry group that has wounded us. It can be an amazing healing experience. And through observing this thing, these interactions, it made me wonder, how do we help people become willing to walk into those kinds of rooms? How do we learn from their faith, from their courage, so that we can also help others to be healed? So that has motivated me through a lot of what I've done. The other story I wanted to share was in my ministry and in my time in the community, I've heard so many stories about non-Japanese Americans who were instrumental in making the internment, the incarceration, a little less awful. There's one family in our congregation that tells the story of the Caucasian family across the road. The family name was Avey, and they had a similar business to our members who are incarcerated. During the war, they took care of their neighbor's property, of their business, kept it going. It was a young family, and they had small children, but they still took, it must have been a 2-day train ride out to eastern Colorado to visit the Japanese American family while they were in camp. They had nothing to gain from this. They had perhaps a lot to lose by siding with people that were perceived as enemies and taking on this extra work and this extra burden. I've heard other stories about people who helped Japanese Americans to find jobs, to find a university to go to during the war, or who looked after their property. We hear stories about the Quakers who also worked on behalf of Japanese Americans, speaking out against the injustice. There was a pastor named Frank Heron Smith that our congregation particularly reveres, who spent his time going through all the Japanese American churches trying to make sure that property remained safe. Many people stored their personal property in the churches, which were shut down during the duration of the war. So he traveled among the churches, and he also traveled to the camps to encourage the Japanese Americans who were in camps. Some people say that he ruined his health doing this, that he gave his life for this. And so as I remember these stories, I know it's important that we continue to tell them so that the sacrifices that these people made is not forgotten. But at the same time, I think I feel obligated in my cultural desire to reciprocate, not just to talk about the stories, but to pay them forward and to find places where other communities, of which I am not a member, need my support, my help, my sacrifice, and thus be involved and honor the sacrifices made by others.
Hello, my name is Kira Ann Raboot Azam. I am a third generation Filipina, Palestinian, and German, English, French. Born and raised in Los Angeles. And I say all of that because I've struggled a lot with understanding where my family's from and hearing the stories of my family and where they come from and why they're here and who they connect with and who I should be connecting with and just who I am. And growing up, we didn't hear a lot of stories, particularly because my grandparents, well, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they both sides spoke either Arabic or Tagalog, and they would speak only in those languages to their friends and relatives that came over, but neither of my parents spoke those languages, so I never spoke those languages. So a lot of stories weren't passed on, and they were only choppy. They were bits and pieces when we did hear things. So I didn't really know what my culture or what my ethnicity was for a very long time. And actually, as I was thinking about today, I was thinking about when I was in 4th grade, we had to make our heritage dolls. And so we were given a paper cutout of a doll, a person. And so you got to pick if you were white or black, number 1. And I was like, well, I'm not that light, but I'm not that dark. Okay, well, whatever. And then I remember going home and asking my mom what my ethnic background is. And she was like, well, Grandma and Grandpa are from, she starts telling me about where my grandparents are from in the Philippines. Grandpa's from Farouk, Ilocos Norte, and Grandma's from Catbalogan, Samar, and your father's family, Grandpa's from Jerusalem, but, no, she told me at the time that he was from Bethlehem, and I later found out that he was from Jerusalem, and Grandma's from Bowling Green, Ohio. And so I said, okay, well, I don't know what to do with my doll. And so we cut her into 3 pieces and tried to put indigenous clothing on each, but I mean, it just wasn't. Needless to say, I was confused. And I was like, that's me? And then I asked my mom where Palestine was. I asked her to show me where all these places were on a map, and there was no Palestine.